We'll just give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining. Okay, well, let's get going. Thanks everybody who's joining us today. We had a lot of interest in this presentation, so I'm really pleased that you could all be here with us today. And I'm so pleased to have Alexandra Rosenblatt and Annie McLaughlin here with me today as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brooke Learman. I'm a state delegate, and along with my teammates, Senator Bill Ferguson, delegates Robin Lewis and Delegate Luke Clippinger, I represent District 46, the Fightin' 46 here in Baltimore City. Of course, I work at the state level to pass and implement legislation that affects the entire state. I have decided to host webinars like this one. This is actually my 5th one on different topics because I think that, you know, part of my role is not just to pass legislation, but is also to be a conduit of information and to make sure, especially in really challenging times like this, that you have access to information from specialists, from policymakers that you need. It does no good if I know it, you all need to know it too. So I am really pleased to have this webinar today by 2 women who I'm really delighted to be able to call friends and colleagues, and one of whom is a District 46 constituent as well, and to have Alexandra and Annie here with us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'll turn it over to them and they'll speak for a little while, and then we'll do some Q&A because I know several of you did write in questions. You can also go to your chat function, and if we have time, we will get to some of those questions as well. So Alexandra Rosenblatt's an attorney at the law offices of Mark B. Martin, PA, where she represents clients in the areas of special education, school discipline, guardianship, and other education-related disputes throughout Maryland. She represents families at IEP meetings, at mediations, and administrative hearings. And in 2012, Alexandra's daughter was born with Down syndrome about 24 hours before my son was born in the hospital room next door. So we are a small city. And that really changed the trajectory of her legal career. So I think on a personal and professional level. And she's also created a group for Baltimore City parents with children receiving special ed services that I'm sure she'll mention as well. Annie is a board certified behavioral analyst who specializes in assisting families through their special education journey, which sometimes it's a hard journey, sometimes it's an easy journey, but it's good to have somebody along with you. And she integrates her experience as a special educator and expertise in applied behavior analysis to help families understanding the strategies, supports, training services, and location that the student's IEP requires. Dr. McLaughlin also provides virtual coaching and training for parents to assist them in implementing behavior support strategies at home. So pleased to have them both here today to talk about our State Department of Ed's guidance on providing special ed services, providing tips to caregivers on how to use this guidance, what to do to ensure your child receives the appropriate compensatory services when they return to school, and more. So I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Alexandra to start with. So thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. I hope everyone is hanging in during this incredibly stressful time. I assume many of you are on this call because you are parents. So know that while I'm going to be providing you with lots of information and advice that, you know, I would like you to take, know that I'm also a parent and I can't always take my own advice. And so I don't want all of this information to stress you out and feel like you have to do everything, because we all can only do what we can do, and this information shouldn't stress you out. So I think, you know, as always, follow your gut, do what you can do. And this information is here for you. And Annie and I are here if you guys have questions. So just a little intro there. We can go to the
No, I think that's good. We're all only doing what we can handle. I mean, you know, it was a battle to get my son to do some spelling this morning. So, you know, yep, we're all there.
Yes. All right, so we can go on to the next slide. So if you do have questions that I guess Brooke is going to be doing, I'm just going to minimize this so I can see. If you can frame them as sort of more hypotheticals and not necessarily about your child, because then we can answer those in a way that is more applicable to everybody else and can be helpful to everyone. So next slide. So we're going to be talking about, you know, what happens for students right now who have disabilities, who have IEPs, who have 504s, what's being provided. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the legal background, and I've pulled out stuff from what has been provided by the federal government and by the state to let you know what they're saying, and so that you can use that information when you're talking to your school systems. And so just as a background, you know, we're in a situation that we've never been in before, right? Like, so I'm a lawyer, I look to case law. There is no case law on this, right? I mean, there's things that we can sort of say are connected, but the reality is that this is in a completely unprecedented time. And so what I'm relying on, what we are all relying, what schools are relying on is guidance that has come from first the federal government, from the Office of Special Education, or the U.S. State Department of Education, and then much later, 2 weeks later, MSDE has come out with their guidance. And so that's where this information is going to get pulled from. I'm going to highlight some of the things that I think are important for parents and for school systems to know about what this guidance says. And that Annie and me will also then talk about just sort of tips and what this means for you guys and how to use all this information. So it will relate for actually how to use these tips. So at March 12th, the U.S. State Department of Education came out with a very brief, very general guidance that basically said if LEAs, which is the local educational agencies, so school districts, if they continue to provide educational opportunities to the general education students during closures, the schools must ensure that students with disabilities also have equal access to the same opportunities, including the provision of FAPE, which is the free and appropriate public education. That's the basic IDEA standard. And that schools must ensure to the greatest extent possible each student with a disability can be provided with special education related services, both under the IDEA and 504 plans for students that are on 504 plans. So next slide. Can we do the next slide? Thanks. That was very brief, and then they came up with a very quick fact sheet that basically said, not only does the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, require that a free and appropriate public education is provided, but basically as a basic matter, the ADA and the 504 of the Rehabilitation Act also require that all online learning and virtual learning tools be accessible to students with disabilities, and that they must be compatible with the various forms of assistive technology that students might use to help them learn. So it just every resource they're using has to be accessible, and we have to make it accessible if it's not naturally accessible. So next slide. And then they came out with a supplemental fact sheet on March 21st, and that's the link there. Next slide. So I pulled this out because I think it's important for us to know as we're dealing with our school systems. what they said about the duty to provide a free and appropriate public education is this. They say that the federal disability law allows for flexibility in determining how to meet the individual needs of students with disabilities. The determination of how FAPE is to be provided may need to be different in this time of unprecedented national emergency. FAPE may be provided consistent with the need to protect the health and safety of students and everyone else. So what that means is, while I'm going to be telling you all the things that you should be, and Annie will be talking about all the things that you should be asking for and that you're entitled to, the reality is that we need to be thinking about this in the terms of the IDEA allows for flexibility, and the courts and the administrative hearings will be saying, okay, yes, but this is an unprecedented time. And so, for you as a parent or schools, to be going in with the guns blazing and saying, this is what my child needs, it's under the IDEA, just knowing that yes, but they're allowed to be flexible in how this is provided. Next slide. So I also pulled this out because I think this is important, particularly when we're talking about what can be provided now that schools are doing remote learning. So what this fact sheet says is, while it may be unsafe to provide hands-on physical therapy, occupational therapy, or tactile sign language services, many disability-related modifications and services may be effectively provided online. These may include, and these are just examples, things like videos with accurate captioning, embedded sign language interpreting, accessible reading materials, and many speech or language services through video conferencing. So it's specifically saying we can do these things by video. And I highlight that because I know that schools are already saying we can't do this. And so there's language that gives us particularly as an example. So it says, consider practices such as teletherapy, teleintervention, meetings held on digital platforms, online options for data tracking and documentation. So, we really need to be pushing the schools to use these because the guidance requires them to consider it, not just, so in other words, if they say we're not doing that, this guidance is saying they must consider it. So if you bring it up, they need to say why it can't happen before they say it simply can't happen. Next slide. So finally, 2 weeks later, so what was happening in Maryland was that, this guidance was coming out from the federal government, and the districts were just sort of waiting until the Maryland State Department of Education came out with their own guidance. And what it meant is that we were really a couple of weeks behind a lot of the districts who were just kind of forging ahead with the federal guidance. But so finally, on March 30th, MSDE came out with their own guidance, and I've included the link there for you. It's called a Technical Assistance Bulletin. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from there, but I think it's certainly beneficial to take a look at that. But I'll highlight some stuff in there now. So if you go to the next slide. So what it says about FAPE, it says a free and appropriate public education. It says that the national health crisis does not abridge the rights of students with disabilities to a free and appropriate public education and equal opportunity to educational services. The school districts must ensure educational benefit to each student when using remote learning. Then it says, in order to determine what equitable access to instruction means for your child, the district must first consider how accommodations and modifications in your child's IEP are provided in their physical classroom, and then what that would look like in a virtual classroom. And again, it says additional support such as individualized telephone or video conferencing should be used when possible. And so what this really means is you want to start with what is in your child's IEP. What supports are they getting? What goals and objectives are being worked on? What accommodations are being provided? And what hours of service? How many hours of direct instruction are they getting from a specialized instruction are they getting? And then from the IEP, that is where the continuity of learning plan, which we'll talk about, is coming from. What is being provided to your student has to be completely based on what's in the IEP. And then thinking about what additional supports you need or your child needs as a result of the remote learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. Okay, so here's the thing. The IEP team does not have to meet to determine how these individualized continuity of learning plans are going to be provided during school closures. So the parent and the school can agree how services will be provided without a meeting. And then based on that agreement, they'll have to develop some sort of document. In Baltimore City, they're calling it a CLIP, which is the Continuity Learning Individualized Plan. Once you get that document, if you disagree with what's in that document, then the school team is required to meet. So the IEP team, it says the IEP team must meet by teleconference or other means to determine how to address the student's needs. So if there's something on there that you disagree with, or that is not on there and you're saying that you're concerned, and they're saying, well, you know, we just can't do that, and you're thinking your child needs that, that needs to trigger an IEP meeting, and that must be convened. And so if that doesn't, you should be requesting that. Next slide. So then what happens is the CLIP is developed and you can agree, and then you agree or disagree with it. The guidance specifically says that formal written consent is not required. So in other words, they can't require you to get a signature before they initiate the plan and the services. But what I've seen in Baltimore City and in a lot of other districts is they do have a signature, you know, they do require you to sign it. I am personally concerned about this because I know, you know, there's limited access to technology, to printers, to scanning. This should not, getting the signature should not bar the initiation of services and supports. So I think that's important for schools to know, and it's important for parents to know. And then the Disability Rights Maryland has also posted a guidance for parents that you should take a look at, and we can provide that, that website to you. They have also recommended that if there are changes made to the IEP or, you know, with this learning plan, either way, whether you agree or disagree, that you should make sure in the meeting notes, which is called the prior written notice, or in a separate email that you write to the school to say to them that you're not waiving your rights to challenges the services that are being offered to your child now during the pandemic, and that it doesn't waive your right to request compensatory services when you return to school. And we'll talk more about compensatory services. So basically it sort of allows you to say, I agree with this, but I'm not waiving any rights to challenge that this was inappropriate later when it comes time to receive compensatory services when we go back to school. Next slide. So this is also really, really key. Neither the federal guidance nor the state guidance allows for an IEP team to say to you, we're not doing IEP meetings now for evaluations, for reevaluations, for the annual IEP, the once a year meeting you have to draft new goals and objectives, simply because the schools are closed. They are not allowed to delay these meetings. I mean, obviously, you know, things were up in the air, fine, let's give them a couple, you know, we gave them a couple of weeks. Now they need to start convening these meetings. They are not allowed to postpone these meetings. And so to the extent that evaluations and reevaluations don't require face-to-face meetings or observations, they have to, you know, have these annual meetings, draft new goals and objectives if that's where you're at in your IEP process. But if the team members do not have access to the data that needed to make decisions, the annual review must be delayed until school reopens. So sometimes, for example, there needs to be in-person assessment. So there needs to be classroom observations. But in the cases where that doesn't need to happen and they have the data to have in a meeting, to have an evaluation, they should be continuing on with business as usual. Next slide. So these are for folks that have kids who are below the age of 3, but 4 in Maryland. If you have a child in infants and toddlers, the guidance is a little bit different. It's not requiring them to provide services, but it's strongly encouraging it. So I think there's, you know, if you have a child that's receiving infants and toddler services, you know, of course they can't be in your home, but if they can provide things remotely and virtually, they should be doing that. Next slide. And I don't know where we are in slides. I'm not sure any of this is where, yes, I think this is where you are stepping in. Let me just say just this first one here. So if you are not in, if for some reason your child is not in the school district in the city, the first point is just that every district is calling these things something different. So it's confusing. So Annie can go ahead and continue on from here.
Sure. And can you guys hear me okay? I know that I
Yes.
had some construction outside, so I needed to put my earphones in. So hopefully you guys don't hear the construction noise outside.
You're good.
All right, great. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of the nuts and bolts of what you can expect to see in some of the plans. I will call them clips just because that seems to come out a little bit better, but it really is that individualized plan that is coming to you. Most districts have contacted students who have IEPs or 504s from kind of the school level to provide information related to what is in the individualized plan. What I've seen in those kind of across the state are goals and objectives directly related to ones that were on the IEP. And they must have those, as well as special considerations or instructional supports. And I'm going to give you some information related to what you could add to the clip that maybe was provided to you or that you're providing to families, as well as the types of services that have been provided, to include how the specialized instruction or related service provider is or is not going to be involved, as well as how long they're going to meet with you or the child. Next slide. So here are some tips, and I did write this kind of thinking we would have more parents, but I did see the note that there are other school personnel here as well. So I think kind of to the parents, and I think to everybody, we're trying to be as realistic and flexible as possible. I have 3 kids. I'm really hoping that the talk I gave them to not come in the room while I'm doing this will work, but you know, most of the teachers and other people providing services, a lot of them also have other responsibilities, such as kids and other jobs that are not quite lining up time-wise. So we do have to be realistic with the availability of providers. And I think both Alexandra and I try to always keep number 2 in the forefront of our mind, is catching more flies with honey than vinegar. And just realizing that a lot of people, I mean, I think, you know, if you haven't been up or down and somewhere in between over the past 30 days, then please send me an email with all your tips and tricks. So just making sure, you know, that some of these services and goals and objectives in the clips, this is all brand new to teachers. Many teachers were not trained online, were not told how to deliver services online. So this is all really new. But when you start to either receive that clip or you're reaching out to your school district, you do want to just start with who you would normally talk to, because most school districts and school personnel are receiving emails. They're expected to respond to them. And so you just want to kind of start with that level. Of course, if you don't hear from somebody, then, you know, you can involve the administration or an instructional facilitator person of some level. It's always a good point to also know what the general education students are offering. This is ranging widely in the districts across the state, from, you know, a lot of pre-recorded lessons on TV to live interaction with teachers to work packets sent home, somewhere in between. So it's really important to know that that also differs by grade in most districts. So if you have a friend who has a high schooler who's receiving some live instruction, but you have a second grader, they may not, the expectation is what's being provided to the general education student across grade levels are different. So make sure you're checking in with the general educator or somebody at the school to understand what the general education students are also being offered. And then everybody has to be super creative. Some people have a lot of experience in creativity and how to make learning interactive and fun. And some teachers are really, really great at that, but also thinking outside the box. And we'll talk about some of those outside the box in a second, but really what I have seen is pretty much a rollout of here's what we're doing for everybody. And I think that was a way to quickly set up parameters that everybody can work with, but it's really important that that conversation is had about can the student access that education in the way that it's being delivered. So if you have a student who is not good with pen and paper and the school is just sending you written work, you got to have that conversation that that's not specialized instruction for that particular student. And then ask for what you need. I have been working with a parent who really needs support with reinforcement, and just how can you get the student or her child to even come to the computer. And so the parent reached out to the school district and said, can you provide me some level of training on this? So the next meeting was about training and consultation to the parent on how to provide that instruction.
Can I just add another example? So
Yeah.
and that can be in the clip. So for example, my daughter who's 7 has Down syndrome. These online, virtual platforms just aren't working for her. And her special educator wanted to add another 30 minutes of virtual instruction to help her with the general education curriculum. And I said, why, instead of that, can we just do 15 minutes a day of you telling me how to modify what's being provided, or telling, I need some help on how to work on reading comprehension. So instead of doing a direct support for her, in addition, we're also adding in just a 15 minutes every day check-in. How much time should I be spending on this? How can I teach this? Here's what's being offered. How can I modify?
That's great. Absolutely. And I think knowing, and I think in a couple slides, that's some of the what to ask for, right? Like, did you know that they could just call you? Did you know that, you could ask to meet live online with them? If the teachers, and I know there's been some discussion as well around teachers having access to internet and video as well. So there's a lot of things. I tried to keep everything pretty general for the tips and more questions to ask. But again, really thinking creatively about, if there is no access to video, or if there's limited access to a printer or stuff like that as well. So next slide. Okay, so I don't want to necessarily read these to you, but I really wanted to provide the information. But these are questions that when you're looking at the clip that's been provided, that you can look at, or when you're thinking about providing them, are there goals related to each domain on the IEP, such as math, reading, social, learning behaviors? There was a reason that all of those domains were identified in the IEP in the first place, because they were considered critical to that student. You might have to think outside the box a little bit about how you do social skills, but that's a conversation to start. And is it social skills with a sibling? Is it social skills where you work on conversation over video or the phone? So you just kind of have to start thinking a little bit creatively. When you're given activities, do you know the purpose of them? So do you know what domain are you supposed to be working on? Are they supposed to be working on math during this? Are you supposed to be able to expect them to do it by themselves, completely independently, or is this a teaching activity? And I think that that's a really important conversation and question to ask, because I have a lot of friends with a lot of kids who are very frustrated that you're not able to just kind of hand something to the kid and have them be able to sit down and do it independently. And so then it's like, well, they're supposed to ask the teacher. Oh, no, this is a teaching activity. So it's just important to understand that our kids range in their development and understanding of each skill. And some skills are definitely need to be taught more in depth rather than an independent activity. Do you need additional support, like Alexandra was just talking about, to be able to support your child's learning? I'm lucky to be a special educator, but most parents are not. So if you can also offer that as a training to the parents if you're a teacher. There's also, I think, an important behavioral component to think about supplementary aids and services, to have that conversation about what was being used and successful in the classroom, particularly when you look at checklists or timers. For kids who have executive functioning, which are some kind of planning, concerns, this is a whole nother platform to go online and try to use Google Classrooms and click in 6 different classes and keep track of assignments and turn them on. And, you know, it's a learning curve for the parents, but it is also a learning curve for the students. And so perhaps your student didn't need a checklist in school learning, but online learning, they may need a checklist. So just kind of see where some of those barriers are and continue to have that conversation. Another piece of information that a parent had wanted was, could she record herself trying to work with her daughter and send it to the teacher and get feedback, because one parent was struggling. And that teacher was so excited to be able to offer that as a training opportunity. And then the data collection component. This is something that I am having a lot of conversation around is it, you know, are we getting information just from parent report? Are we getting information from only things that teachers can observe during live instruction? Are we looking at, you know, assignments that are turned in? And I think that this is where everybody has to really have an open conversation. For some kids, it is the stuff that they turn in. For some kids, it is parent report. So it is really important that the teachers also look at trying to set up opportunities so that they can see that skill live, but that may not work with the attention span or time constraints that the individual may have. Next slide. Okay, so when you're trying to think a little bit creatively, this is just kind of, I wanted to give you the spectrum of things to think about, where you could ask and work with families around individualized instruction to include live synchronous discussion like some of you are having here, or asynchronous. So some teachers have done quick 5-minute videos that they have then pushed out on links on YouTube that are amazing phonics lessons, right? But they're short and sweet, but they are familiar, friendly faces. I know kids have just really been lighting up to see teachers, you know, their teachers on TV as well. So thinking about how specialized instruction could also happen that way. Instruction is happening both in, or kind of across the gamut, in large classrooms that are meeting all together. Some small groups can continue to happen, as well as individual classrooms. And this again has to be flexible with, if a person doesn't have access to a phone or a tablet, that instruction has to then be modified so the individual can hopefully access it auditorily. Thinking about what the general education students are accessing and being provided, and how those specialized goals relate to the general education. Also thinking about online programs. So some students do much better and engage in those online programs that have a high level of feedback and engagement. And so having if you can't get your child to come to the computer and sit and listen for 30 minutes, but they will play a learning game, I think it's important to have that conversation about access. And so many of these programs are providing either free access, or the districts already have access, or something along those lines. So it's, and a lot of them are tablet ready or phone ready. And then that last piece is also thinking about the parent training component. So I think about the parent training both around education, but also around behavior. So thinking about, what kinds of trainings and supports do families need around specialized instruction, reinforcement systems, I would say firm boundaries, but, also understanding expectations can be somewhat difficult during these times. And I think, will we address some of these questions at the end? I did not try to read them while I was talking. You wanna?
So this is just to let you know that if you do have disputes, state complaints are sort of being put on hold. And if you do end up that you are already in due process, where you have a disagreement with the school system and you filed a complaint with the Office of Administrative Hearings, those can be delayed, but are also moving forward. So that's just as an aside. You can do the next slide. So basically what the guidance says is that provide all these things to the extent that you can to the extent that you can't, we're going to deal with it as compensatory education, which means make up services when people come back to school, whenever that is. I don't expect that, say we're out for 12 weeks and your child receives 2, or 1 speech and language service a week, that you're going to get 12 speech and languages services a week, or, as makeup, because of what I said about the flexibility and these unprecedented circumstances. But I think that to the extent that we can, or that you as a parent can show harm or regression or particular impact from being out on a discrete issue, then I think, that makes it more persuasive in terms of getting either makeup services or increased services when you come back. And so in order to set yourself up to have that conversation and to have the data that you need to be asking for compensatory services when you go back, the first thing is study your IEP, right? I mean, that's always the case. They're so hard to read, I know, but really look at the present levels of performance, understand where they were at when it was written, understand what the goals and objectives are that they are working to achieve, and by when's the deadline for those, when does the IEP expire? And then hopefully, this is a big hopefully, but second quarter was January 2020, and IEP progress reports should have gone out. And it should also include data on where your child was at with their goals and objectives as of January. This is essentially your baseline data right now because we went out shortly thereafter. So take a look at those IEP progress reports that you got, see what they were doing in January so that you have something to compare to when we go back. The next piece, is take your own data. So for you, test the skills that are in the IEP. You know how it says, they will do something in 3 out of 4 trials. To the best of your abilities, try to do your own trials, test them on their skills, and then write it down. You don't have to be perfect at it. You're not a special educator, but keeping a notebook of what they are able to do, and then also recording behavioral observations. How is their attention? Are they engaged in this virtual learning? What are their barriers behaviorally to be able to work on this stuff? Keep track of that stuff. It's essentially your journal and your data when you go back and you're asking for this. But the bottom line is it's going to be easier to be arguing for compensatory education on particular issues where you can show harm.
And Allie, on that same line, a couple of people asked whether schools will be required to hold IEP meetings right away.
Yes,
Okay.
So the MSD guidance explicitly says each team is going to be required to meet upon the return of school to make this determination. And so if that doesn't happen, I would say as soon as we know when we're going back and we get a date, request an IEP meeting, because it's gonna get crazy real soon. So get your request in and get that scheduled.
Right. It'll be like how the Department of Labor feels now.
Right. So the next slide. Oh, sorry. Do you have more questions?
Nope. Go ahead.
Okay. So what's next? Brooke can probably answer this question. No. So that you can go to the next slide. So we might have some other legislation, both federally and on the state level, about what's happening with all this. I predict that, or I know that the Maryland State Department of Education is going to be putting out more guidance, which they're called technical assistance bulletins. They might be providing clarification guidance. And so if what you're finding is that certain things aren't being implemented the way that I've described they should be, they need our feedback. So, if things are really not working, I think we need to be, MSDE needs to be hearing from us so that they can provide this clarification. And then I think there's going to be some more guidance on how this compensatory education piece is going to be done. And then I think we should expect that summer school is really going to be used, or not expect, but it's very possible that summer is going to be used as a time for compensatory education or an extension of the school year. And then finally, that we know that the state superintendent has told the school systems be prepared for some sort of remote learning, not to say that we are absolutely going to be there in the fall. There might be intermittent returns to school. It might be regional, it might be spotty depending on outbreaks. The bottom line is schools are on notice now that we need to be setting this up for the return of school if this continues on.
Yeah, and I'll say that is consistent. I mean, that's consistent with what we're hearing from school systems too, particularly around the summer school piece and talking to partners like Young Audiences and others that do summer learning. nobody knows if those programs will be allowed to happen yet this year, but everybody is hoping that they will, and hoping that in some form we can move to those. And so there are discussions, I know, ongoing about how to get those programs and get programs also run by the city and other organizations to a place where they can accommodate additional students, from who will need the services this year. So definitely those conversations are happening. Yep. I would also add, I think it's important to give feedback to the schools and your principals and MSDE, but also as a legislator, like, let us know, if your child if you are encountering barriers or there's a huge problem, and we can take it up to the next level too. If MSDE isn't doing or putting out the assistance that they should be putting out, that's, although we can't force them to, we can certainly be loud about it and question why they're not doing it. And, frankly, if things don't work out and we do have a special session and there are problems, then we're in a better position if we know the problems to propose solutions, or at least hold a piece of legislation over the head of MSDE.
So I need to, if you want to jump in here, I think like at all times, I think the message that I want people to take away, and these are in all the workshops that I do, but especially now, is, two things. One is go with your gut. You know your child better than anybody. And two, we should not just assume. So schools are offering these programs and saying this is what we're providing. It is your right as a parent, and it is the right of parents to meaningfully participate in that program. You don't need to just accept what's being offered. You can challenge that. You can ask for an IEP meeting. And just like in all times, get the supports and services, get the supports that you need to be able to advocate if you can do that. I can tell you, this is what I do for a living, and I get my daughter's IEP, her clip, and it stresses me out and I don't know what to do. And like, if I'm stressed about it, it's hard to do on your own. So to the extent that you can, advocates like Annie, attorneys like me, others around the state are helping people. And I know that we both, are still working. So I don't know if any of you have anything else there.
I think also just kind of in general, looking at some of the questions and to understand that some other groups of people have done what we need right now, right? So somebody asked about what about people who have kids who have severe challenging behaviors. There are assessments that are research-based FBAs that are done virtually that have been shown to be effective.
Functional behavior.
So, what behavior? Yeah. So around behavior, like, what'd you say?
You said FBA, so I was just saying.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, special ed. Too many acronyms. Assessments. So functional behavior assessments. That if you really cannot get your child to access the instruction that is being provided, there are assessments that are research supported to be able to be used. Some schools just may not know about them because they've never had to do them, but there are other disciplines. There's the word I was looking. There are other disciplines who have done those types. Also looking at support on online learning. There's a whole discipline on online learning and doing assessments. So I saw some questions related to IEPs and assessments, thinking about a lot of school-based people know how to deliver assessments person to person, and those have been normed and used that way. But there are, I've worked with a couple of psychologists who are doing tests virtually and are doing things like running records or doing other types of assessments that have been shown to be valid over kind of a tele education approach. So I think it's important to also help and work with the schools and kind of, I hear everybody about, I'm worried about IEPs that are written right now. If you can get good data, then writing an IEP is okay. Mm-hmm. I think you have to be very cautious if you feel like you don't have good data, but that has to be documented, right? And I think that conversation between the school and the parent on, what type of data you have, what could be collected, what would be valid, couldn't have that discussion. So I think when I think about support, I'm thinking about maybe even looking at accessing other disciplines for school districts to look at, people who have done a lot of online learning, online assessments related to education and behavior.
And also it's good to know, that if evaluations can happen in person and you do need in-person data, and that does need to happen when you return to school, what's going to happen is that your current IEP will not expire and you won't be eligible for services. Your current IEP will be extended and you'll be working under the old IEP. That being said, there's nothing to prevent the team from drafting some new goals and objectives or modifying some objectives, say if they've achieved goals and or achieved objectives. So you're not going to lose services. You're just going to be working under the old IEP.
That's interesting. There were a few questions too, following up on that a little bit about, and some of the behavioral stuff that you'd mentioned earlier, Annie, about mental health resources or students. Are there mental health resources that students are able to access remotely, since many students receive them through the school, typically access to teletherapy or social work services? Do you have any thoughts on those types of services?
Sure, absolutely. I think, I would say that direct contact with the school-based personnel is a great place to start. I have had clients who are still getting group therapy through social workers. I had one student only able to call in, but everybody else was on a video call as well. And actually some of those services have been increased. Due to some of the additional stress that is happening in some kids and parents' lives, as well as I have also seen wonderful collaboration where teachers are doing things like morning meetings or community circles, and social workers are joining them just to check with the mental health and check in, also happening to all the students, not just students with IEPs. But I would go to the school-based personnel, most likely because they will have local resources. Right now seem to be kind of the focus of people coming forward to being able to support therapy and mental health therapy. But it is the waiver of some of the compliance pieces of not having to use platforms that are HIPAA secure. The governor made that an option, has really allowed access for people to then get a therapy session using something like FaceTime or, a Skype or something like that. That is not, something that ideally you could use a HIPAA platform, but if you don't want to limit access to services because of that. Yeah,
definitely lowers the barrier a little bit. There were a couple of questions in the chat we could look at too. One was, can you give an example of an IEP meeting where in-person data is not required? I'm concerned about holding meetings without valid present levels of performance. And a follow-on to that was just concern about IEPs without classroom observations, present level of performance, and assessments or testing that aren't normed for this environment. Do you want to, either of you, address that? Maybe Allie, I don't know. Either of you address that a little bit?
Annie, you might be more, yes, no?
Sure. So, I think I would look at what, if any, assessments or data can be collected. It may be, if you can get the video of the parent in the right book, if you need to, get a assessment of a reading level, can that be done in the home? So I think you don't want to exclude the opportunity just because maybe you have to photocopy the book and send it to the kid and see if you can get it. And it might take a couple, if you're trying to do a running record, how many words per minute can they read in 60 seconds? And the kid is interrupted 4 times by a little brother and that can't be remedied. Then that's your data saying, we wanted to write an IEP, but we don't have valid data. And, there's one piece of information to be able to then have a conversation about attempts of giving student services. So I do think kind of trying to drill down into what can be done. And then are there portions, like Alexandra was saying earlier about, can you amend the IEP with an additional goal or objective that you might be able to get data on?
Right.
I think it's also important to know why, why you need a new IEP now. I mean, there are certain reasons where we really need to, make sure the IEP is done now and follows the guidelines. But a lot of the times, from a legal perspective, I can say that if we draft a new IEP now, right, and then you go back and you've had this last few months as remote distance learning with the new IEP, and then your child doesn't make appropriate progress next year, a team is going to look at the fact that we were out of school, and that period of time may not be valid anyway in terms of whether or not your child has made sufficient progress. So it may not necessarily benefit you to draft a new IEP now. The question is, what do you need the new IEP for? Do you really need new goals and services now? Do you need to update something now? And then also just thinking about, say, for example, your child is in 5th grade and they're going into 6th grade. Okay, well, there you might want to make sure, going into middle school, there you might want to make sure you have the IEP upon the return to school, because that particular transition is important. But it's not automatic that you absolutely need to draft the new IEP now unless there's a particular issue.
That makes sense. There was a question sent in about an organization who provides online lessons in agricultural education and how they can adapt their lessons. I'm going to say that those folks, it's a pretty specific question, should just get in contact with you guys, and your contact information is on the next page there at the bottom, because that was a sort of specific question about how to make sure they can adapt lessons to ensure special needs students can participate equitably. Great question, really important one, but I think pretty detailed. I also, there were several questions about just behavior and how to make sure, how to really, at home, do you have any, guidance or ideas for kids who do have behavioral challenges or behavioral problems, to getting them to focus for a little bit, or, I don't know if Annie have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, and we could do, a three-day training on behavior supports, but I think some of the real tips and tricks right now seem to be around predictability and setting a schedule and routine. That really, when we have a schedule routine and can predict what's coming next, it tends to lower everybody's anxiety and kind of baseline to then be able to possibly engage in some learning. So setting a schedule, being somewhat flexible with the schedule if you can, if somebody needs a break to get up, or, students are reading things laying down on the couch now. But I think having some of those expectations related to, today we're going to get one little math thing done, right? It's only going to be 15 minutes. And those are some of the tips and tricks, really working with your special educator who knows your child very well, to say, okay, I can't get him to even come to the table, right? And the answer, depending on the individual child, may be, okay, we'll go sit next to him on the couch and try, this 5-minute video clip on YouTube that uses his favorite, music to try to get the child to engage. I will say I have seen some very dry instruction that is hard to watch. So I think expecting a young child at home who has never had these expectations to sit down and watch a 30-minute very boring lesson is really hard. I know my kids were like, up, I'm out of here, So, yeah. And I come with that background. So I think thinking about a schedule, a routine, expectations, and building on the expectations. I've also really worked with parents to bounce between, if you can, high level of attention from an adult to a low level attention from an adult. So that would be something like, really sit down, work with your kid if you can, talk to them, read them a book, play with them. And then if you need to do something, try to get them engaged, so that rather than thinking about a child being in your presence and being able to kind of work on their own for a couple hours is really hard. So I think looking at high level engagement with an adult to medium to low and interspersing that is people who I'm getting a lot of calls right now from people who are still trying to work full time from home and need to also teach their child. So you know, trying to creatively schedule meetings if you can as well.
From 8
and-
p.m. to 11 p.m.
Yeah, right. And you know, it's like people are like, oh, can you meet at 9 o'clock? And I just cannot meet at 9 o'clock. Two of my kids have live meetings at that time, right? So it's just, if you can, try to recognize what's not working and try to, and parents will need to do different things. This is a different time. So definitely thinking creatively around behavior supports and expectations, and noticing what upsets the parent, I think, is also really important, so that you can then try to problem solve.
Yeah. And knowing that we shouldn't be expecting our kids to be able to work as long as they're in school. I mean, that's just not necessary and not realistic.
Not realistic. If I get about 90 minutes of good work, I'm psyched.
So some states and school districts have really started to release, you know, I would say what would be more reasonable expectations based on grade and age, and then to realize that disability also impacts that. So, you know, 2 15-minute sessions may be way more beneficial than 130, and then trying to figure out if you can fit that in a work schedule or a nap schedule or all those other things that are going on at home. It's also really hard.
Yeah, that makes sense. We did have a comment that I just wanted to raise up from a pediatric psychologist at Mount Washington Pediatric Hospital. They are offering telehealth therapy for children and adolescents, which is great. So her website, will send that around as well. But I know we're getting close to a time that I promised we would finish. So any final points from you all, and then we'll wrap it up. Alexandra, you want to start? Any final comments?
I think I said everything that I would have said, so.
Great, good. Thank you. Annie?
I do think just to know that this is an evolving practice right now, right? So the state and the feds are still releasing things. Alexandra, like we're expecting some stuff to come down from, you know, the federal state, you know, and then the state's going to have to interpret it. You know, I feel like to try to stay connected to, you know, websites and, you know, maybe another briefing with Brooke or something like that, because this is going to change as more guidance comes out. And then just to try to understand that's going to be expected. Probably right when things start to become predictable and calm down, it'll change again.
And then on a micro level, all the things we said about what should be in these learning plans, you can also change, right? Like if you have something in your plan that's not working, there's nothing to say that you can't go back to your team and say, we need to change this plan.
I think that makes sense. Well, thank you. Thank you both. This was informative, really helpful. I hope everybody online enjoyed it and found it helpful and enlightening. I like to close these webinars just with a note of gratitude. I think we're all in a really difficult place right now and face really unprecedented challenges, but there are really amazing people out there doing important work every day. I have the luxury of being able to do some work from home, like these webinars. Not everybody is able to do that, and so just want to recognize and thank, you know, all our community leaders, our public health people, our doctors, our nurses, transit workers, grocery store workers, all the teachers out there who are doing this work, and principals who are trying to get stuff online to help our kids, and all of the work, Alexandra and Annie, that you are doing to support our families. There is, you know, a lot to be grateful for, even during these really challenging times. So thank you, all of you. We will be putting this on YouTube tonight, and it will be available tomorrow. So to all of you out there, thank you so much. Take care and keep in touch. Bye.